the European car market is just been stagnant. Sales has been very weak since 2018. The prospects are quite bad because the population in Europe is shrinking. Cars last longer, so there's not much prospect for overall sales. And also the European consumers do not yet seem to be demanding EVs on the levels that would be needed. In the end, the 15% deal is not a bad thing for car makers because obviously, 15% compared to 27.5%, that's much better.
It's been a difficult first half of the year for European car companies. The latest numbers from Stellantis, Mercedes, Porsche, and the like paint the same picture. Tariffs have eaten into their profits. Could the new framework trade deal between Washington and Brussels now help? Well, to help us sort it out, we're speaking with Franziska Palmas. She's an economist at Capital Economics, and she joins me from London. Franziska, thank you for joining us. Give us the bottom line. How brutal a first half was this for European car companies?
Yeah, it was certainly a difficult first half. We saw disappointing earning reports from them across the board. Obviously, the German car makers particularly hit, but obviously these car companies, they are attributing some of these difficulties to tariffs, but obviously it was already a pretty difficult environment for car companies before then, due to a lot of deep running issues in the sector that are still also coming through.
Let's touch on those in just a moment. Just for our viewers, since April, here's a reminder of what the car companies have been facing. Since April, they've faced import tariffs of 27.5%, and it's definitely had an effect. Mercedes' profit for the first half of the year, compared to the prior year, was down more than 50%. For BMW, it was roughly 30%, and Volkswagen saw a roughly 39% drop in net profit for the first half compared to last year. As Franziska said, tariffs are, of course, part of this story, not necessarily the full story. Let's start with tariffs, though. Franziska, many of these car makers produce in the U.S., so why are they exposed to tariffs?
They are still exposed to tariffs because, of course, yes, they do produce in the U.S., but they also have even more significant operations in Europe. Obviously, not all of what they produce in Europe goes to the U.S. So a lot of what they produce in Europe is actually not exposed to tariffs, but they do export a non-negligible share of production that they have from Europe to the US. And obviously that production is hit by tariffs. If we think, for example, about Germany, around 10% of the car production that happens in Germany is exported to the US, and that's obviously subject to tariffs. It's obviously not that big in the sense that there's a 90% that is not going to the US, but it's still significant enough to have an effect. And then obviously there's also concerns about the fact that some of these car companies also export to the US from other locations that are outside the US, like from Mexico, and there is a risk obviously of some of that being hit by tariffs as well, even though for now most of that is included in the exception that there are around tariffs for Mexico.
How important is the U.S. as a market for foreign car makers? Give us some sense. We think of China, obviously, as a very big market, but I would imagine the U.S. has to be one of the largest.
Yeah, so there's an interesting point to make about this, is that it's perhaps not as important as you might think, considering the importance of the US in the global economy. So as I was saying, if you think that 10% of the cars produced in Germany go to the US, that's obviously a significant amount, but it's not the majority share, right? The majority share of the cars produced in Germany are sold in Europe, and even if we look now at the car companies and at their global sales, the US is still accounting for the German car makers for between 10 and 20% of their global sales. Europe makes up between 50 and 60. So, to put it into context, it is a relevant market, but other markets, especially the European market and in part the Asian market, are more important in size, much bigger in size than the US market, which is why I was denoting that although the car companies have put this emphasis on the hit from tariffs, which is obviously outside of their control, there's definitely, I think, in those results also problems that are coming from the European and Asian market rather than the US one and the tariffs.
Right. I just wanted to ask you about that. But also, I would imagine the U.S. market, that's an economy that's done pretty well compared to Asia and Europe, correct? So maybe these car companies have looked a bit more towards the U.S. I guess help us understand how it looks in Europe and Asia right now.
Yes, so definitely, for example, the US market, we had seen before all these tariff issues an increase in exports of cars from Europe to the US, and the US market had a bit kind of like helped to cushion the blow, for example, from the decrease in demand that was coming from China. And probably, yes, in terms of growth prospects for the car makers, the US market maybe looked like a more promising area, where there might be still rising consumer demand for cars as opposed to Europe. So to say a bit more about the problems that they're facing in Europe and in Asia, the European car market is just been stagnant for now a long time. Sales has been very weak since 2018. And the prospects are quite bad because the population in Europe is shrinking. Cars last longer, so there's not much prospect for overall sales and consumption of automobiles in the Europe to grow. Which is, and to add to that, the problems with the Asian market are mainly connected to both the Chinese economy slowing and the fact that Chinese firms produce themselves very good cars, especially EVs, so the European producers are losing a lot of market share in the Chinese market, and that has obviously been hitting the results.
So the Chinese market may look not as great as it once did. The European market, as you said, has been struggling since even before the pandemic. The U.S. market looks more positive. It bounced back from the pandemic in a better way. We've seen better economic growth. You had a 27.5% tariff for a while. You've taken a big hit. Now there's this kind of framework trade deal. It looks like 15% instead of 27.5%. There's still questions, of course. But if you're a car company and you're looking at that, what are you thinking? What does it look like? Is this good news? Is this bad news?
Yes. So, I think overall, given what they might, what in this situation they could get, in the end, the 15% deal is not a bad thing for car makers because obviously, 15% compared to 27.5%, that's much better. It's more than 10% less tariff rate. So I think overall, and it was clear because Trump was, even in his rhetoric, particularly targeting, especially, the German car sector and sounding very disappointed about the fact that the US was, for example, importing so many cars from Germany. So that, I don't think anyone was hoping for a tariff of less than 10%. Maybe there was some hope for a quota, but, it was clear that the previous status quo of a 2.5% tariff was just not achievable. So given the context, I think car makers will be fairly satisfied with the 15% rate. And at least that gives them somewhat clarity. Obviously, it's still much worse than the pre-Trump status quo, which was a 2.5% tariff. There is something, though, that the car companies themselves would probably do to mitigate the hit from the tariffs. And one of those things is obviously increasing their production in the US. For example, the German car makers have significant production facilities in the US. Utilization of car plants in the US, capacity utilization is fairly low. So there is probably scope for the car makers to increase their production in the US and reduce the numbers of cars they export from Europe to the US and mitigate in that way the effect of tariffs as well.
That's a big problem politically in Europe. Most likely, if that happens, it could be, in theory. Yes. There have been fears in Germany, especially about deindustrialization, the fact that manufacturing jobs in many sectors are going back. And this, as you said, incentivizes production in the U.S. What steps do you expect Germany, Brussels to take when it comes to incentivizing production in Europe or to mitigating the effect of these tariffs? Is there anything they can do? Is there anything the industry wants them to do and says this needs to happen now?
Yes. So obviously, the German government has already been trying to help out industry a bit. They've announced some plans to, for example, cut corporation tax, also some cuts to energy taxes, although that might not be, that is more for more energy intensive industries. It might not help out the car industry that much. But clearly, the German government has been starting to do something to help out the industrial sector a bit. The other thing, obviously, that the car industry has asked for is a loosening of, rules connected to emissions and, this complete phase out of the internal combustion engine in Europe that is planned for 2035. And that is creating quite a bit of problems for the German car makers that don't seem to be quite on schedule for that. It's possible, that we'll see there some relaxation of that in order to try to help out industry. And some other attempts to, reduce taxes a bit, maybe some subsidies, and maybe some purchase subsidies as well. The German government has said that it will reintroduce EV purchase subsidies. So this sort of policies. In the grand scheme of things, though, given the clear, the weakness of demand in Europe and in Asia, and given, the reasons are very structural, right? Like shrinking population, big competition from Chinese producers, the governments can only go so far with some subsidies, some tax cuts here and there. I think there's not going to be enough, basically, to halt a reduction in the production of automobiles in Europe and in Germany specifically. I think we'll see more declines there.
The European car makers say that they're committed to electrifying their fleets, just like they were before, that there's already a lot of investments made into that and investments coming into electrification. When so much emphasis is on the U.S. market, and it's clearly diverging in terms of electrification. Under Trump, there's less of an interest in electrification and incentives in many ways against it. What kind of problem does that pose for European car makers who are trying to electrify on the one hand on this continent, where they've made a lot of promises and where there's a framework for a Green Deal, and then on the U.S., they want to serve that market? Could, in other words, the transition to electric be made much more difficult here in Europe because of what's going on in the U.S.?
Yes, I think in part, probably yes. Then it's also true that maybe, car producers produce different models in different places. So they might, start to produce more EVs in Europe and more cars to serve the US market in the US. I think it's not just, in the developments in the US that make this transition to EV difficult. I think that the problem is also in Europe, where on the one hand, you have these rules that, dictate that the car makers can only sell EVs basically from 2035. But on the other hand, and so they've been trying to, meet that deadline. And the German car makers, for example, have already converted a pretty significant share of their production to EVs, I think around 1/3. But the production, they're not as efficient in the production of that technology. It's much more expensive for them. Their margins are lower. And also the European consumers do not yet seem to be demanding EVs on the levels that would be needed, first to reach that goal and also to make it profitable for their car makers to make this conversion in their production, partly because the charging infrastructure is not yet as good to incentivize even more switching from consumers to internal combustion to EVs, and partly because the EVs are still so much more expensive than the internal combustion engine. So there is, even leaving aside, I don't think that the US side that is really creating that problem is more an internal European issue, that that the rules at the switching in the production hasn't matched with increased demand for EVs, and that EV production is still much more expensive.
All right, that's Franziska Palmas with Capital Economics. Franziska, thank you so much.
Thank you.